Hey y'all, welcome to Waterbreak with the Waterboy. Yes, it's Thursday afternoon already. Already working our way towards Sunday. Can't wait to worship on Sunday. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for joining us. Make sure you guys share the show. I will be, of course, hanging out at YouTube. I know some people watch this on Facebook and other places, but I'll be on YouTube doing my best to pat my head and rub my belly and try to monitor your comments while running the show here also. Before we kind of get into things, of course, you guys can already see Pastor Tim in the background here. Glad to have him on, but make sure you guys we get a lot of people that reach out, want to know how we can support you guys, what you're doing. The best way to do that is through joining our club, through club membership. You go to fightlaughfeast.com for that. But you can also, if you have a company and want to become a corporate sponsor, please reach out to us at contact@fightlaughfeast.com. That's contact@fightlaughfeast.com. And we got all sorts of creative ways you guys can work with us and sponsor what we're doing. And this also brings me to our conference. We have our conference in Nashville, Tennessee coming up. It's actually Lebanon, Tennessee, on the politics of sex, September 9th through the 11th. So signups will be available starting in June. I know we're a little late on that process, but signups will be available in June. And of course, if your company wants to booth or vend or be a corporate sponsor at that conference, we're expecting a couple thousand people in Lebanon in September 9th to 11th. So it'd be a good opportunity not only to support what we're doing, but also to get your work and your company before a bunch of people, a bunch of fun, rowdy Christians in Lebanon, Tennessee. Lastly here, our magazine subscription is our next magazine is coming out in June. So if you kind of want to get in before that issue, subscribe now, and you'll be able to get into our next magazine that'll be shipping out in June. And that's, of course, on feasting. The title of that magazine's In the Presence of Mine Enemies. We got Rosaria Butterfield, Rachel Jankovic, Pastor Wilson, Pastor Toby, me, and a bunch of others writing in that magazine. So like you said, you probably already know this, but it's a quarterly book-like experience. It's fantastic, and we want to make magazines great again. So make sure you go to fightlaughfeast.com to grab that magazine. Without further ado, I've gotten the pleasure to get to know Pastor Tim over. Man, this kind of shutdown has brought a lot of interesting people into my life over the last year, and one of them is Pastor Tim. Really got to first. I had him. I think did you come on Waterbreak initially, or did you come on our Sunday show initially? What show did you first come on?
I think I first came on Waterbreak.
Yeah, okay.
If I remember correctly.
Yeah, and then Pastor Tim, his pastors a church, Fairview Baptist Church in Calgary, Canada. And how long have you pastored there at that church?
7 years now, or about 7.5 years at this point.
And then you have your wife, and I think it's 8 kids. You just had another one in December.
Yeah, I have eight children. My oldest is 12, and my youngest is just a few months old, born in December, and 4 boys and 4 girls. And so teams are even at this point.
Yeah, even out. And then where'd you end up at seminary? Where'd you end up going to Bible school or seminary?
I went to seminary in Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary. We lived in Windsor on the Canadian side, and commuted across the river each day to go to school there. Yeah.
Well, very good. What made you? How'd you end up in Detroit going to the college there or seminary?
Well, I was saved later in life, and I already had a career that I was retiring from, and wanted to get into pastor, get into ministry. And so I didn't really know much, and so pastors here in Alberta were giving different schools, and almost all the schools recommended were American schools, because there's not too many good theological schools here in Canada. Mm-hmm. And so this was a school that I could go to and still live in Canada, and still be able to work there and care for my family. Wow. And commute across every day. So it made sense. And then I learned a lot reading their journal before even knowing about their school, and profited from their journal. And so I thought this would be a good fit theologically.
So how long ago did you become a Christian then?
I became a Christian in 2008. 2006, that's when I actually had family send to me and my future wife Paul Washer's Shocking Youth Message. Mm-hmm. And that's the first time I ever heard the gospel really explained clearly. First time my wife ever even heard Christian preaching. Wow. And that led to, this us just grappling with these things and listening to more Paul Washer online, listening to John MacArthur. Mm-hmm. And so it's around the fall of 2008 that we both experienced, conversion, where we had a change of desire, change of heart attitude, where we really understood the gospel, committed to follow the Lord Jesus Christ. And then, so 2010 is when I went to seminary, from 2010 to 2013, and started pastoring in 2014. So,
wow.
I'm relatively new to this, but yet by God's grace, there's so many good resources out there today that we can really profit from and dig into in order to be equipped to be a Christian and then to lead a congregation.
Yeah. Amen. What, did you not grow up in a Christian family? What was your background? Because your brother's a Christian too. And he's an associate pastor.
He is. So we grew up in a Christian home, but yet much of my influences as a young person was just living for sports and for other things. And so I didn't really pay attention too much to what was being said on Sunday. My Bible mostly just stayed in the car on a Sunday so I could get points in Sunday school on Sunday morning. And so I didn't really have much of an understanding of really what it meant to follow the Lord Jesus Christ. I was kind of assumed, like, you pray a prayer, you ask Jesus into your heart, you're a Christian, you're all good.
Yeah.
I didn't know what it meant to actually be a disciple, a follower, until I was, when I was old enough to kind of make my own decisions. I just lived worldly. I wasn't involved in the church, and went off to school and just wanted to make lots of money. Was working as an engineer in the oil field up here,
right? And
that was my goal: just make as much money as possible so you can buy all your toys.
Yep.
Before that Paul Washer Shocking Youth message kind of hit us.
Right. That's fantastic. And so, did your wife not grow up in a Christian family? What was her background?
She grew up in a Catholic household, but very, very nominally Catholic. Right. It's just the routine. You don't ask questions. You don't understand your faith at all. And so that was her background. So both of us were just, we didn't know much.
And now you have 8 kids and you're all in, man.
Well, 8 kids. I have to say, Vody was up in Alberta not too long ago, and I told him that he's a big reason why we have 8 kids, because when we were first Christians, someone sent us some Vody stuff, some Vody Bacham stuff, and that committed us to having letting God just take control of our family, and so now we have 8 children. Right,
and now let's kind of get into the recent events. Let's kind of go. Take us back a little bit before you got arrested, kind of the weeks leading up. What was church like? What was the pressure like? What was leading up to your arrest? What was going on?
Yeah. Well, here in Alberta, there was an uptick in cases, and so they're predicting, a third wave, and it's going to lead to a lot of hospitalizations and other complications. And so the biggest alarm bell that's been going off is trying to save the hospitals from being overwhelmed. And so restrictions came to try to prevent that. And so churches were affected, where the maximum capacity for a church, regardless of how big your auditorium is, was 15 people. For funerals. So if one of those persons was dead, the maximum is 10 people. If you're outside, the maximum outdoor gathering is 5 people. And so it was really heavy-handed on the restrictions for the last number of weeks. And as my own family, we have 10 people in our family, so we can't meet with anybody outside. In Alberta, no one can come into your home. That's not allowed.
Wow.
And so it was like the lockdowns have been really oppressive and restrictive and really intrusive into the home, intrusive into the church.
Right.
And so we continued to gather and to practice hospitality in our home and to live our lives normally as we can as a church, because Christ is worthy of his worship, and we're going to come and we're going to gather.
Amen.
But what happened on May 6th is there was our Alberta Health Authority, their lawyers went to a judge and got an injunction, because there have been restaurants that have been rebelling in our province as well.
Right.
And so they got an injunction against the restaurant, and also they tried to expand it to anyone who is acting in like effect to this restaurant by continuing to defy public health measures.
Right.
So essentially they got this injunction or restraining order against the province of Alberta, 4.5 million people, that anyone hosting a gathering in contravention to the health orders can be arrested.
Right.
And so we knew the heat had kind of turned up. And so I had written letters to my wife and my children, anticipating that arrest would be possible. But as the weeks went by, it didn't happen. On May 9th, the police were outside of our church. So this was not this past Sunday, but Sunday before. The police were outside our church, and They never came in and they never came out of their vehicles.
Right.
And I learned after the service that they actually pulled over a gentleman leaving our church who was visiting our church because they thought he was me, and they served him a copy of this injunction. And so they got the wrong guy.
Yeah.
And so when they were there this past Sunday, in the police mind, they thought they already had served this man the injunction. And so they were coming now to arrest me, having given me warning of that injunction.
Yep.
But what had happened that week before, we were preparing for what might be an arrest.
Yeah.
But yet earlier that week, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom, it's a law firm here that is representing myself and James Coates and others.
Right.
They took our Alberta Health Authority to court to try to narrow that injunction to only apply to that restaurant
Right.
That is named on there. And so James Coates and I were talking on Friday, and we're happy because now this meant that, we could breathe a bit easier.
And the judge ruled that order only applies to I think it was the coffee shop, right?
That's right, only to the Whistle Stop Cafe. And so we were kind of breathing a bit easier, thinking, okay, we have another Sunday where we can gather together without being hauled off to jail.
Yep.
But when the police came after the service, they actually gave me a call on my phone first because I was loading my kids into the van and they were concerned about the kids. And so this police sergeant called me and he said, "We would like you to ask your wife and your children to leave because you're going to be arrested today."
Oh my goodness.
And so I said, "No, they're not leaving. Like, if you're going to come to arrest me, then arrest me. But my wife and my kids are going to be here." Wow. And he kept trying to implore me. He says, "No, sir, you have to send your wife and kids away. It's going to be traumatic to them. You have to send them away." And he goes, "Look, go talk to your wife, and then I'll call you back in 2 minutes."
Yeah.
And so I went and I told my wife, and I said, "The police just called me, and they're going to arrest me today." And so she was kind of in shock, just processing what that meant.
Yep.
And said, "Of course I'm not leaving, and of course the kids aren't leaving." So.
Yep.
And so when the police officer called back, I said, "They're not leaving. And if you're going to arrest me, you have to do it here." And so a bunch of police cars and vans all pulled into the church parking lot.
Yeah, criminal.
And that there's a video online, but I had a chance to, hug my family, say goodbye to my wife, and talk to some of the men at church before they brought me ultimately to jail, to the remand center, which is a maximum security facility. It's not a good place. It's worse than a typical penitentiary or jail. And so I spent 2 nights and 3 days there.
And basically maximum security.
Yeah, the same kind of center that James Coates was in.
Why didn't they just take you into like an overnight jail? Why did they take you to maximum security?
Well, they brought me to a police station. They kind of booked me in, give me a phone call, and I was in a cell there. But they brought me over to the remand center, and I guess that is the protocol because this was supposed to be the action for being held in contempt of court. This court order is to be brought to the remand center.
Yep.
So whether you're a pastor or whether you're a murderer, you're brought to this place.
Wow.
And it wasn't pleasant at all.
Wow. And so basically, they as I understand it, and as you're telling the story, they arrested you illegally. They served the injunction to the wrong person, and then the injunction, even though they served it to the wrong person, still didn't apply to you regardless, and then they still arrested you.
That's right. And so I told that to the police officers. And he says, "Well, I have no knowledge of that. We'll take you in, and that'll get sorted out later."
Wow.
And I think and even in my hearings that happened on Monday and Tuesday, it seems to be that our government is using this as an opportunity to try to crack down on anyone who is publicly standing against their health orders, and questions about the legality or whether they should be doing this or not will be pushed off and answered later. But in the meantime, they're acting so unjustly to carry out these orders.
So when you had your hearings on Monday and Tuesday, did they just ignore the fact that you weren't served an injunction, and then secondly, that the injunction didn't apply to you regardless? They just ignore that?
Yeah, it was so hard because I had a chance to call my lawyer on Sunday and just let him know where I was and what was happening. And I knew there would be a hearing upcoming. And so on Monday morning when they brought me and they shackled me to bring me to the courthouse.
Wow.
And so as I'm sitting there in shackles, I'm asking to use the phone to speak to my lawyer. But because of COVID, there's the lawyer is not there in the courthouse, the judge is not there, and there's no capacity for me to use a phone to reach them. And so when they bring me into the courtroom, I'm sitting in the courtroom alone with the courthouse clerk. And the hearing begins, and I haven't even spoke to my lawyers yet.
Wow.
And so as they start discussing this, I haven't had an opportunity to fully explain, what happened the week before and about the injustice of this. And so all these decisions were being made, and it wasn't until I was actually brought back to the remand that I actually got a chance to use the phone and say, look, like this is what's happened. And if any, at that point, conditions were given on my release, and I said, I can't agree to those conditions that will prevent me from pastoring my church. And so it had gone online that I was being released on Monday, but I actually had to call my lawyers and put a hold on that because I didn't want any conditions upon me that would prevent me from doing what I'd already been doing. And I had to call my wife and explain that to her. And it was heartbreaking because at that point we thought our one hearing about release conditions was kind of one and done. And my trial date was set for June 16th. And so my wife and I were talking about not accepting these conditions, and that would mean that I'm in remand for a month. And we were both committed to do that for the sake of Christ and for his gathering of his church.
Amen.
But then thankfully there was another court date on Tuesday, and I had a chance to speak to my lawyers before that in order to convey some of this information to the judge.
And then, so did the judge release you because of the injunction and the illegal arrest? Why did the judge, on what grounds did the judge release you?
Well, the judge was motivated to release me because he knows remand is not a good place, and my own lawyers didn't want me in remand either. But in order to talk about the legality of the actual arrest and the injunction, the judge didn't want to decide on it right then and there. And so that's not going to be decided until June 16th because the lawyers for the province, the Alberta Health Authorities, and their lawyers, they were saying that regardless of this, the change to the injunction, it still applied to me and it still applied to everybody. And so they were being really disingenuous about what is going on. And it seemed like they were intent because I think they've been embarrassed for months and months and months by churches gathering that they're out for blood. And so they didn't want to budge at all. And so essentially I'm out and I'm under I'm in the same state that I was in last week. And so that injunction in the eyes of the law still applies to me. And so if I gather my church, they can arrest me again. But there's no extra conditions that I'm under. There's no agreement that I made to follow in order to be released.
So did you have to sign?
Same spot I was in last week.
So you didn't sign any papers that were going to be, some sort of barrier to your conscience if you got released.
That's right. And that's what I had to hold on to. I could sign nothing or agree to nothing that would prevent me from honoring Christ and my commitments to pastor my church and to gather together to worship. Because if a local church doesn't gather, you're not a church. So I have to do that. And the consequences is the same this week as it was last week.
So all the cops that are involved in all this and are kind of basically just going along with, basically, as I see it, a Marxist organization like AHS, did they express any remorse or any, are they thinking for themselves in all this? What's going on? What was your experience with the cops?
Yeah, my experience with the police officers and with the correction officers in the jail were, the bureaucrats at the top make the protocols and the guys down on the ground just follow those protocols. And that was, for the most part, my experience, that them just doing their duty. There was a few exceptions to that where there were a few guards and a few police officers, one police officer especially, who seemed so heartbroken at what was happening. And he actually came into my cell while I was being held at the police station before I went to remand. And he said, he goes, what they're doing to you is terrible. It's unjust. He goes, I would never go to arrest you in your church. And so he was very sympathetic. And when he actually dropped me off, put me in the van, and it's basically a dog kennel in the back, and dropped me off at the prison. And when he left, he looked like he was completely gutted, completely heartbroken, like he might even cry, leaving me there. But that was the exception. Most of the guys there that I had a chance to talk to about my condition and what was going on were like, why can't you just do like every other church? Why can't you do a drive-in service? because most of the churches here are compliant and following the rules. And if the government says no more than 15, well, they go online and say, well, why can't you do that?
Right.
And so people are having a hard time because of the lack of a Christian witness, and trying to understand, what they see as a few nut jobs like me and James Coates that continue to meet.
And what's funny is like the cop that just demonstrates that they aren't thinking people, because, well, why are you arresting a pastor? It's like, why can't you go to online church? Well, it's like the response is, well, why are you arresting a pastor? No one's actually asking the critical, thoughtful questions in all this. Are we in a legitimate pandemic is another question that you can't ask. The cops they're just going along with whatever they told. And that's why when they're talking to you, they're asking you the question. You're on trial, and they should be the ones on trial in all this.
That's right. And when they say it's for my safety and for the public good, they brought me from my church, which has never had an outbreak.
Yep.
I've never had COVID. Our church has never had it. We've never had any transmission. We never added to any hospitalizations or anything like that. And so they brought me from that, ripped me from my family, and then brought me to the remand center, which has an active outbreak of COVID, which has, hundreds of cases of prisoners having COVID over these past number of months. And so it's just ludicrous that this was actually for anyone's safety. It's purely for, I think, the government just being embarrassed that they're not being listened to when they tell us that we can't do certain things.
So I traveled to Calgary. Oh man, it must have been 08, 09, 2010, something like that. I was there for my previous work. And one thing that kind of struck me about Calgary, I was like, well, this is kind of like I was there for, what do they call it? It's that big kind of cowboy festival. What do you call it? Stampede?
Stampede.
Yeah. I was there for the Stampede. And it reminded me a lot of Texas, where I grew up. I was like, oh, this is kind of like, the Texas of Canada. But, come to find out through this pandemic, you actually got a lot of people without backbones there, and apparently a lot of churches that have no backbone. Since you've been out, are you getting any encouragement from the local churches? Are you getting any rallying points from other churches?
Yeah, well, both myself and my wife, we have gotten huge support from Christians everywhere, from the States, from Christians in Mongolia, China, Iraq, saying they're praying for the persecuted church in Canada.
Yep.
While for the most part, pastors in Canada are saying there's no persecution here. We just have a couple nut bar pastors who will continue to meet. Yeah. And so it's kind of sad. So I am getting support even from guys who don't agree with me, like, Tim, we're praying for you. Yep. But yet there's no movement in churches that would consider define the guidelines now than they would have a few weeks ago. Right. It seems that most people, like, we're 14, 15 months in here. Most guys are kind of set on their course. They have led their congregation a certain way. Yeah. They've either been heavy on Romans 13 or other areas, and so it's really hard now for them to change course. Right. They continue to offer and ask the government for permission to open the church, and I think that boat has long since sailed. Yeah. The government is not listening, and so we must obey Christ. Yep. Rather than ask essentially Caesar for permission to do what Christ has already commanded us. That's
right. What is your theological journey been in all this? Did you start out at the beginning of this pandemic, and even when you started to see, okay, this pandemic is not what our AHS is making it out to be. So when you came to those conclusions, what was your theological? Have you been on a theological journey, or were you already at these convictions even before you got into this pandemic?
Yeah, well, I think certainly when you think about separation of church and state or these kind of doctrines, you kind of know them in the back of your mind, but they've never been practical. You never really had to pull them out and use them and flesh them out. And so when this first started, we, like most churches, we complied because we thought people are going to be dropping dead everywhere. Right. And but it was a few weeks into it we realized this wasn't right, and I was pastoring or preaching. I made sure not to even call it preaching to our church, but I'm giving an address through this camera and over the internet. Yeah. But it wasn't long before our people and also myself, like our hearts were breaking because we are a church that practices one another's, that practice hospitality. We're in each other's homes a lot. So to break all of that and then to call Zoom church, we knew that wasn't church. Right. And so we began to talk about gathering together even before we were allowed to by our governing authorities.
Right.
And of course, you had to deal with Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2. So back last May, I wrote an essay about looking at those passages, and my convictions on those passages hasn't really changed since then. But through this time, I think my theological convictions have sharpened, and become more deeply rooted in my life as I've gotten to know. Like I was really profited by Joseph Boot and his book, The Mission of God. I read that when this pandemic started, and that really helped solidify for me kind of the role of the church, the role of the state, the supremacy of Christ over all things. And so I think the one doctrine that has really been such a beauty in all of this time is the lordship of Christ over everything.
Yeah. Amen.
And that has really been so great for myself personally, for our church. We've learned so many Psalms through this time, and Scripture has seemed to come alive. As we've experienced through this. Right. And so it has been such a blessing to me and to the church as our theological convictions have really been refined and tested. And Christ is worthy. He's Lord, he's King. And that has become so precious to us.
Amen. I remember, so when our church, I think, had a similar response with you back in March when our shutdown occurred, which was March 20th, we, like you mentioned, we believe that God's given three governments: family government, church government, and civil government. Those are the three governments that God has given us. And then, of course, you have your individual responsibility, your individual government, if you call it that. And we believe that the government does have temporary authority in crisis, temporary authority in health crisis, temporary authority in war, temporary authority. So we had no problem, deferring to our local officials for a couple weeks. And we did, and we did online church for 3 weeks, and then we did church in our cars, I believe, for 3 weeks. And then once we started seeing that this wasn't what everyone was making it out to be, we decided to go back to in-person church, regardless of what our local authorities did. And so we did that. The week we decided to go back to church, they also opened up. They also, allowed us to go back to church. But our decision was regardless of what they were going to decide. And so, I have, in the same way the government has, let's say temporary authority when there's a building on fire. Right, I have no problem the government coming in and saying, hey, everyone get out, the building's on fire. But one of the things you find out in that whole process is that we actually agree that the building's on fire. We agree our city's on fire, whatever. Everyone can see it, everyone agrees on it, and then gets out. But even then, they only have temporary authority in our church. Let's say our church building's on fire. They come in and say, hey, everyone get out. We all agree. Everyone gets out. But they can't take our building from us, right? It's like they don't have long-term authority, even in those moments of in this case, a pandemic. And I think that's part of what the church has done. The church has been so, God has blessed the Western church like crazy. The money that the Western church has, the buildings that we have, all the way down to the running water. It's God's given the Western church so much, and what that has done is that's just made us a bunch of fat Christians, a bunch of fat and apathetic Christians. And so we didn't have to strengthen and sharpen our theology of the Lordship of Christ. The theology of the Lordship of Christ doesn't really mean anything until you have to apply it. Obviously it means everything for the world, but when you start to learn what your theology really means, when it starts to, rub against the walls of your house and outside in your car and in this world, and so the church has gotten really fat and lazy, and that's why we've groomed a generation of pastors who are cowards, and I don't think they wouldn't think they're cowards, or they wouldn't think they would even be going that direction, but then all of a sudden, you wake up in this world and all these, seminaries that have been grooming these pastors for all these decades, and now look at the church now. One of the things I've been so grateful for in our shutdown here in the U.S. and in what's going on in Canada is God is really making it clear who the faithful pastors are, who the faithful churches are, and before, when everyone has their church building and no persecution or no challenging of the church's public stance and public theology, every church kind of looks the same. Every pastor can even say the same vocabulary, use the same evangelical vocabulary and so forth. But God has done us a great service this last year in showing who the faithful churches are up in Canada and who the faithful churches are here in the U.S. And unfortunately, they're very few and far between. Even here in the U.S., they're very few and far between. So, how are you looking at this in relationship to what's going on in Alberta, and then what's happening, in the coming Sundays here in your town?
Yeah, in terms of here in Alberta, I know one of the developments that happened after I was arrested and taken away, and then when people left the church, the police came back after with the health authorities and put a big closure notice on our church. So they've closed down our church building. And so they haven't put the fence around our church like they did the James Coates Church, but our church has been closed as well. And so
did they change the locks?
As far as I know, they haven't yet. There's been some people have reported that. I haven't gone to check it out myself yet. So we'll see if that happens or not. But what we're going to do is the church must continue to gather. And so there is it's incredible to believe, but there is a growing underground church here in Canada. And we almost you have your state church and you have your underground church.
Wow.
And so, we have churches like that here in Alberta. We have some in Ontario and other places.
Yep.
And so we'll have to join those brothers and sisters in doing the same thing.
So are you guys basically going underground?
Yeah, it's hard because I still am committed to the public witness of Christ and his church.
Yep.
But yet to know that if we gather in any kind of public fashion this Sunday, both myself and anybody else who might be organizing that will be hauled off to jail. So it might be a one Sunday, you're one and done. And so as I think about a pastor and think about more of a long-term thing, obviously, there's a court date coming up next month.
Yep.
Hopefully, which will overturn this terrible, tyrannical injunction upon our province.
Yep.
And would allow us to have more freedom to gather without threats of arrest every single week. So it's hard as a pastor to try to, do we want to have a big public gathering on one Sunday, have a big bang, and then we're all in prison, or do we want to, how to think about that long term?
Yep.
And so it's been like a day by day, a Sunday by Sunday, trying to plan to do what is best. And ultimately, what our prayer for as a church is that all those who want to find us and to come into worship along with us would be able to do so.
Yep.
And then all those who are trying to find us because they seek our arrest or imprisonment, that they would be blinded and thwarted from not knowing where we are.
Yeah, amen. Now, one of the things I know it's your calculation to make. You're local. You're the pastor. There's layers of decisions I can't see, but one of the things I've been thinking about in all this is, one of the Christians are not very good at pursuing. We do a great job maybe causing a situation, exposing a matter, that kind of thing, like you kind of exposing, getting arrested and kind of exposing the tyranny that's going on in Calgary and so forth. But then we don't know how to pursue. Now it might be best for your church to go underground, but one of the other possible ways to go about this in a way of pursuing it is actually, now having, 10 of your, men arrested at your church, your elders and everyone just, flood the jail cell with godly men, pursue it that way, overwhelm them, make all these officers just, feel even that much worse. I know that's a calculation you have to make, but have you kind of processed that side of things?
Yeah, and that's especially some of the younger guys in our church. That's their heart. That's what they want to do, and what the expectation from that is when you make such a statement like that you're wanting, the heartstrings of those police officers to be pulled. You want the public to see how egregious these lockdown measures and then these punitive measures are.
Yep.
But what we've seen through the imprisonment of James Coates, through the locking up of his church, through my own imprisonment, is that the wider Christian community in our province is unfazed. by what is going on. Even to have me taken away from my wife and my 8 children, my wife with a baby strapped to her, it's not having the effect that you would think it might have.
Yeah.
It seems like there is such a coldness here. The church is so sleepy.
Yep.
And so whether that statement would have an effect, I'm not sure what else needs to be done in order to awaken people. Like James Coates was in jail for 35 days. His
That's
church
incredible.
has 3 layers of fence on it. I was arrested. Other pastors have been arrested in this province. So how much more needs to happen before other churches say, hey, this is enough?
Right. The comfort we have in all this is God knows, sometimes you take steps, you make moves, Apostle Paul, jumps over the wall to leave, and God's blessing all those calculations. God's blessing all those movements by Christians. And so we know that God's in heaven. He's watching over all this, and he's sovereign over it all. And he's using faithful Christians to move culture. Now we might not see everything that's going on because of how God operates and functions in spiritual warfare and so forth. But we do have that comfort that Jesus is king. And when you go to jail for being faithful with your church and being a good shepherd, I can't trust a husband who's not going to protect his family. The kids can't trust a dad who's not going to step in front of them and take a bullet from them. A church is not going to, so in the same way, the church is not going to trust a shepherd who's going to not put his life on the line for the church. To be a shepherd means to protect the sheep. That's what it means. And to be a shepherd means that you're putting yourself in front of all the sheep, in front of the firing lines, and that's what it means to be a good shepherd. And we need to read the story. We need to be able to look at what true leadership looks like, and know that the reality is that you're being a good shepherd. You're laying your life down for your sheep. You're protecting your sheep. You're making sure your sheep are ministered to. I've been watching other pastors in Canada who, one pastor in Canada said, hey, just because I haven't been arrested doesn't mean I'm not being a good pastor. And I'm like, maybe, okay. But why are you saying that on Facebook, first of all, publicly? It's obviously you're a little insecure about how you're, pastoring your congregation right now. Come to find out, he's following all the governmental orders of his church. And it's no wonder you're responding that way. You're just submitting to the government. You're just obeying the government in Canada. I believe he's in British Columbia, and it's kind of silly that you got Pastor Coates, you and others have been arrested in Alberta, and then that's your response online. Hey, just so you know, I'm just because I haven't been arrested doesn't mean I'm not being a good pastor in my church. And I can't with full confidence say I don't know if you are being a good pastor actually. With what's going on in Canada, I mean, come on.
Yeah, and what we've seen, I know it's same is true for James Coates Church and our church. We have really knit together as a community. Mm-hmm. The church that is gathering, they know that I love them.
Yeah. And
I know that they love me.
Yep.
And it's been so precious
yep.
through this time. And so every time we gather together, that is a special time of singing, of praise, of worship. Yeah. And so people who come in to our gathering and who witness that, they confess they've never been part of a church like this before. Mm. And we have people who are just coming through temporarily. They're like, no, I'm gonna move to Calgary so I can be part of this because this is a family of faith yep. that I've been longing to be part of.
Yeah.
And so it's that at the end of the day, besides all of the external public things that is going on and all of the politics that are involved, that committed family of faith, that's so precious.
Yeah. Well, hey, Pastor Tim, I really appreciate you, man. Me and my wife are praying for you and your family, and of course, we followed it all over the weekend and everything that was going on, and may God be glorified, and may the church be strengthened through all this, and hopefully, space is being created when a pastor defends his sheep. he's creating space for his sheep to live freely. And so we need far more of this. We need obviously politicians speaking up and all this. But what the actions that you do, even if you can't see all the benefits from it, and there are many, God is working through you and what's going on in Canada. So, man, we're praying for you, and we'll be back in touch. Hang on the line here before we get off here. Hey, everybody, thank you for joining the Waterbreak. We got a great Sunday special coming to you on Sunday night. We got Pastor Wilson coming in the studio to talk about marijuana, believe it or not. It was a great show. Looking forward to, hope you guys enjoyed on Sunday night, so make sure you tune in. Until next time, love God.